Welcome back, everyone. As mentioned, I wanted to go into more in-depth follow on from my video on about modifications to your factory four-wheel drive. And this video is just going to focus primarily just on lift kits. It's only going to focus on lift kit and suspensions. A little bit on lift kits, mostly on suspension because it is such a in-depth suspension. Is a large piece of information to cover. I needed a video just by itself, and I even had to try and redo this to try and shorten it because of the amount of content that's involved. Normal disclaimer as before, if you've got anything that I missed or you believe that you have some value to add or would like to make some comments about this or changes or so forth, obviously I welcome those constructive comments, and as long as they're kept civil, so I welcome all that sort of stuff. And what we're going to be covering is essentially these list of topics. So lift kits, the variations of body versus body and suspension, and then go straight into suspensions itself, shocks, some areas of shocks that you might have not known so much about that is quite relevant, some types, and being leaf spring, coil, the solid axle and independent suspension, the differences between the two and the pros and cons of those, and finally airbag suspension. So quickly on lift kits for the body. So lift kit bodies, these are essentially where you get nylon spaces and you place them between your frame and your body, and you get generally a 2-inch lift. I put this here as a note for anyone from WA. I don't know about other states, but I made sure for WA law, essentially you're not allowed to raise your vehicle roof beyond a maximum of 50 millimeters, whether it be by lifts or tires. Now, without trying to get myself in trouble with what I'm about to say, I don't know if anyone would get out with a tape measure and check against the manufacturer's stuff to assure that you've met your requirements, but for prosperity, it's worth noting that you would technically be driving a vehicle that's not road legal if you went above that. So just keep that in mind in the back of your heads when we talk about some of this stuff. The pros with body lift kits themselves, they are generally cheaper compared to suspension upgrades. Your shocks themselves, they don't need to be changed when you add in spacers, so there's no changes that need to be made if you just want to lift it. It gives you it gives you clearance for your wheels themselves, so the wheel arches, you get higher movement, higher arches, so more ability for your wheels for movement if you need them, and the ability to add in or change to get larger tires themselves, whilst keeping in mind that law. Cons, this is time consuming to have them placed in, and that's generally where most of the cost of placing these come into it, is the time. Some don't like the fact that when you lift, more of the frame of the vehicle becomes visible. Personally, I don't find that to be a con, but some do, so I left it in. Can interfere with your center of gravity, which can affect the chance of rolling your vehicle if you've lifted it, especially if you lift it too high. That center of gravity goes up, so depending on your forward driving, you can risk tipping. I just put it in there because it is a possibility, however minor, and it does not provide any performance improvements by just lifting it. There's no change in the performance of your car. Suspension lift kits, on the other hand, are not limited to the same like nylon spacers, although generally they're focused on vehicles that I would describe as rock hopping. because they involve longer shocks, longer control arms, sway bar disconnect options, and so forth. Some of the pros, obviously you're not limited to the size of how much you can lift it by. Your suspension becomes more articulate, meaning your axle can move up and down more relative to your chassis whilst keeping your wheels in contact with the ground. The cons of this is I put getting in and out, because even my car with a small lift, it's a step thing to get into my car. With the higher ones, can get even harder. It can also void your warranty, so make sure you check on that before you do anything to not void your warranty. And it also may not be as smooth of a ride. It's also more expensive, and its maintenance issues can become a problem and be expensive as well. So I'm moving quickly along, because last time I recorded this, it went way longer than I hoped, so I'm trying to speed it up this time around. Suspension's rather involved and complicated. There's a lot of varieties and types out there, so we'll focus on a few of them and go through a couple of different aspects of them. I just wanted to point out with this one, because I got another picture coming up, and I might come back to this picture, because there are two types of versions of a solid axle suspension system. This is one with the leaf spring, and this is one with coil springs. So these are two solid axles, but two different designs to it. That'll come up later. I just wanted to point that out for when I talk about it later, you'll know what I'm meaning. So when you get yours from the factory, you'll have whatever suspension they will decide for you. More often than not, most vehicles will come with what we call coil spring or independent front suspension, which are coil springs. And there are varying types of ways coil springs and independent front suspensions work, and we'll go into that. I'll touch on that in a second too. But it's important to understand a little bit more about them, so you can make the best decisions for yourself when it comes to upgrading yours for your vehicle, for your usage. So some of the factors that affect your suspension is things like weight capacity, your flex, the comfort, durability, your terrain, and whether or not you want to improve the flexibility of your four-wheel drive. So weight capacity is considering when you are generally modifying your vehicle, you're adding a lot of extras to it, i.e. your bull bar, which I'll cover in my next video. As one of the aspects of it is that it creates a lot of front end weight, so you need to consider altering your front suspension to accommodate for that extra weight. Other aspects of these things for weight capacity is rear bars or rear protection weight aspects, whether or not you're putting in dual long-range fuel tanks, rear fracks, and whether or not you're putting carry frames and weight on top of that, being rooftop tents or just carrying extra stuff on top, fridges, water storage. This is all around touring stuff. So you need to maintain a balance between the weight capacity and your four-wheel drive option in accordance with that. And then when those weights are out, what's going to happen with your four-wheel drive ride as a result of that, and how that affects the comfort. So it's something to keep in mind. Flex is a capacity we look at. So if you got your springs are too stiff, it could result in a more bumpy ride when it's unladen. So this is if you've got a huge amount of weight on it and then you take the weight off. Those springs are designed for that weight, will result in a more bumpy ride when the weight's not there. Flex is very much high on our agenda for people going like us going off-road, because it's what determines keeps your tyres on the ground, so you get your traction and allows your tyres to tilt and manoeuvre. The more generous the flex allows you to move over more difficult terrain without tipping, which is your chassis moving from over your wheels. So the other aspects we want to look at is comfort. So you want to have a smooth ride whenever possible. So researching and balancing the need of off-road and on-road is important, I think. So do you consider that when you're looking at brands and the type of usage? Durability is, I put it right up there as a very valuable factor, because that your four-wheel drive suspension is going to take a massive beating, particularly if you've ever travelled on gravel roads. The corrugation can be really have a negative impact on your suspension and wear out your shocks really fast due to the amount of heat build up, which I'll touch on when I talk about shocks in a bit. And due to the terrain we have here, durability is a huge factor when considering what to do. Terrain, much like the above, but you take into account what sort of usage you are going to do. So a weekend four-wheel driver is different from someone who spends most of the time four-wheel driving in their car. But if you're one that drives that car mostly to work and then goes out four-wheel driving on the weekend, your suspension change in accordance with that. Improving your flex is it's just looking at ways of getting more flexibility. But this is where you come into the fact of adding something or putting in a positive might introduce a negative on another end of the scale, i.e. a stiffer spring might reduce the amount of weight capacity that you're able to carry. So look at when you're doing this, just look at the pros and cons when you're changing something. So quickly looking at suspension and shocks. So not teaching our subjects, but the two main basic parts of the suspension system are the springs. So whether they be leaf, coil, or torsion bar. I don't touch on torsion in this video because it's less seen these days. So I've left that off altogether to save time. The components and then the components they're attached to, whether they be independent suspension arms, live axle, or solid axle, which in turn then attaches to your wheels and your shock absorbers. Here's an example over here of a compression extension of shock absorbers. So the spring part extends after compression, so it oscillates, basically moves up and down. So your spring itself, much like a normal spring, it'll continue to go up and down continually whilst in that state. The shock's designed to dampen the spring aspect of it from continuing to go up and down when you hit something, so you just don't keep going is to take that out and return the four-wheel drive to the normal state. Your shocks are filled with oil and they have a piston rod that goes up and down inside when under compression. So the rod takes up room as the oil is incompressible. Some have inside of them. Some have high-pressure nitrogen gas. Others, they use foam. Gas versions can be twin tube or monotube. I won't touch too much on that. I think I mentioned mono and twin a bit later, so I'll leave that alone for the time being. Due to the nature of forward driving, your suspension you needs to be durable. So as you bounce up, and the reason why is because as you bounce up and down on the terrain, it creates kinetic energy, and that kinetic energy turns into heat in your shocks. And to prevent heat damage to your shock, you need something that is robust enough to be able to handle those rigors of off-roading in comparison to normal standard driving on the road, where it's not going to see as much movement, therefore as much friction, as much heat. So you need one that gets rid of that heat faster thus avoiding damage to your shock or your if it explodes, damage to your vehicle as well. So issues to consider being weight from accessories, your bull bar, and our environment here. If you're in a hot environment and for touring and so forth, it's harder for that heat to dissipate when it's hot. And the corrugations, we've got a lot of corrugation in travelling along gravel roads. Gravel roads are a nightmare for shocks and can cause huge amount of heat build up and can cause real big either wear out your shock faster or damage them completely. So there are options for things like remote reservoirs, like we're talking about that's where we talk about the mono or twin tube shocks, but they just generally are not well suited for your standard four-wheel drive because of the amount of room that they need to have to be able to be used. So instead, I would say look towards foam cell technology, and this is the reason why we look at upgrading your factory suspension, because it's not designed for off-road. Foam cell. So this is just a picture of an Ironman one. I don't personally say a particular brand. I always recommend you research your stuff yourself as well. But like Ironman do foam cell, nitrogen gas, and I think it's called Express foam cell, which is an upgrade on this one. I think it's a bigger bore as well. Then you got ARB's version of the old MU suspension also have a foam cell option. Obviously, the cost goes up for foam cell over nitrogen gas. Nitrogen gas is obviously better than the standard oil, but there are variations to it. So remember, bigger diameter shocks, so larger, fatter shocks, means it has more ability to hold more oil, thus creating the ability to absorb more heat. But it's still oil. So look at variations like nitro gas variations or foam cells. Foam cell as a technology, this is an example here of how it works, but basically it's better at heat dissipation compared to either the conventional, which is the oil, or twin or mono tubes. It has a foam layer that floats in the shock on the outer chamber, so a lot of the oil contacts with the entire surface of the outer tube, so to help with the heat dissipation. And unlike the gas, which sacrifices oil surface for some a surface area for the gas, foam doesn't. Also, bigger bore, so bigger diameter shocks allow more surface area. More surface area means more area for that heat to dissipate or the heat to wear off. So look at if you are capable of a larger bore option shock absorber. And there are different brands, so always do your research and look into that before making your decisions. You're always welcome to ask, and I'll give my opinion, but I try not to point in any particular brand way, and encourage you to also look at your own options. So quickly moving along to leaf springs. So leaf springs, very simple suspension system, been around since I think horse and cart time. They basically work on lengths of anchored spring steel, and each spring steel plate is arched and then compressed and stacked on top of each other, and they can be mounted either above or below the solid axle beam, and they're bolted to the axle. The leaf spring then supports the weight of the vehicle and secures the axle to the frame, and this is why you often see them in utes for the rear, due to the multi-leaf system being able to take on varying weights as the different springs are engaged on the different weight levels. So longer springs are engaged and the shorter springs are engaged at different weight levels. and that's what makes them useful. You used to see them sometimes on 4 drives, both front and rear, but that's been moved away from, and you generally only see them on the rear of vehicles that have the need to varying weight, like utes. Pros and cons of these. So leaf springs, the pros being that they're simple, they're the fewest parts, so there's not a lot of moving parts to consider, not like independent front suspension when there are lots of bits and pieces that can go wrong. They're simple, and they serve to keep that rear axle in place without complex suspension linkage requirements. As mentioned, the weight is being carried is spread out more evenly across the load of the entire spring, rather than with the coil, or we'll leave the torsion out of it, but rather than the coil, which has got a limited space or area where that load's compounded on. So there's only a small portion where all that weight's limited to, whereas a leaf spreads it out across the whole thing. Also, the friction between leaf as they slide reduces the natural up and down rebounding effects of spring, so helping with a smoother ride and reducing the work that these shocks need to do. The cons, though, is that they're directly bolted to your rear axle, so there is an issue, like in this picture, of torque twist, where hard acceleration or braking can cause the axle wind up to create vibrations, causing rear end squat or no diving, which can cause this to have this effect to your leaf spring, which can damage it over time and reduce your ride comfort levels by stiffening up those springs. And when you know they lose their resilience over time, you'll notice this with the drop in ride height. So coil springs, they're made of hardened timbered steel. They're wound up in a spiral formation. Most passenger cars nowadays always feature coil springs on all 4 wheels. You're seeing more SUVs and some 4-wheel drives are incorporating them in not just the front, but also in the rear as well. There are varying types. McPherson strut is the one you see the most frequent. It's where a bit like this one, where you see the spring on the outside, the shock on the inside, attached to the main frame. There are varying other ones out there, but we really don't need to go into different types of mounting fronts, different strut mounts of coils. So coil springs, they can either be firm, soft, or have a varying rate. So the spring rate is what we refer to as whether it has the rate at all points being linear, whether or not it gets stiffer with compression, it's called progressive, or it's configured to characteristics where it's dual rate. So here's an example of the 3 different types. So here's a dual rate one, here's a linear one, and here's a progression one. That's what they would look like if you were to look at them separately. So a lot of ones you'll see are generally in a lot of cars are progressive. The dual rate ones are a little less common. So here's the example of that McPherson strut that I mentioned before. So this is how it attaches to the wheel. There's the coil spring, the strut, this fixed to the top of the car or the top of your vehicle, and essentially this is the way it works to absorb that impact. So coil springs, they allow for more flexibility when it comes to variable characteristics, which allows for a more comfortable ride when the vehicle is unloaded. As weight's added, though, the spring rate becomes stiffer to increase stability without the effects of bouncing, and prevents the ride height from dropping significantly. That's that when I said the dual rate one, that's the one we're talking about there. From a four-wheel drive standpoint, though, coil springs can allow for a great amount of up and down wheel travel. That's one point, but which can be helpful for rutted or rocky off-road conditions. But there are a lot of limitations around this, which we'll touch on when I look at the difference between independent front suspension or independent suspension versus live solid axle. Cons is that coil springs aren't well suited to carry heavy loads like leaf springs, so that's why utes and so forth will stick with leaf springs on the rear. As vehicle weights is concentrated on a smaller surface area of the frame compared to spreading the load evenly out. So when you're loading a vehicle, it's all centered just on this point here rather than spread out on a leaf spring. Always check your factory coils because they might not always be designed for the rigors of off-roading, and can easily and quickly become damaged or not very well. Essentially, they don't like the off-roading that we do, so look into the quality of that. You don't want one that degrades very quickly, and you have to replace frequently, and this also applies to the aftermarket. When you look at solid axle and live or livery axle, they sort of mean the same thing. Solid axle, so this is an example of like solid axle where it goes from one side to the other, so both wheels are connected to each other by the same beam. So essentially what happens to one side happens to the other side. As mentioned, they're considered simple, durable and repairable, and often, as I mentioned, seen in utes, and they tend to be stronger and rated better for weight carrying mass compared to independent suspension or / coil springs, and can provide better articulation than independent suspension, particularly with consistent clearance underweight compared to independent suspension. And I've got some pictures coming up that show that. So here's an example of what I mean by what happens to the one wheel happens to the other. This is the difference between independent and solid axle. When you lift one side of one of the wheels, the other side is affected and goes down. With an independent one, if this one goes up, it sort of pivots off the middle of the vehicle from the suspension point. So this can go up without this wheel being affected at all. So it can be a positive, but as we'll see, it can also affect the clearance in an example that comes up. So independent four-wheel drive suspensions, they're more complicated. The most common design, because there are numerous, is the one that has the what we call the two A-arm pivoting off the body of the chassis with a wound coil spring in between. So it looks like this picture here, where you can see that's the frame that goes through and underneath, and this is where we've got an attachment, much like the McPherson strut sort of attaches to the top of the frame. The springs in the middle, the springs on the outside with the shock running up and down through the middle. Any independent suspension, if well designed and tuned, will provide a better ride than live axle, as if it hits bumps, it absorbs it without transferring the load to the opposite wheel. Although most of the time you won't notice if you've got good shocks with your solid axle. Shocks can help mitigate that you don't even notice it. It can be good for off-road, and I say can, with limitations, with the right quality, but with some cases, suspension compression from weight can lead to a lower ground clearance, so that can become a big issue, particularly if you're putting a bull bar in the front of your car. You can really lower the ground clearance of the front of your vehicle. when running with the independent front suspension. So here's that image I was talking about that demonstrates that. So here's one with a solid fixed axle and independent front suspension. So this is a vehicle under normal conditions with normal ground clearance. This is a vehicle under weight. You notice when the independent suspension is under weight, it can actually cause the ground clearance to be reduced because of the weight pushing down on the suspension, causing it to become closer to the ground, whereas the the solid axle does not change the clearance. Here we have an example of it when you are putting it through on an angle or through terrain that's different on one side than on the other side. This requires it to tilt. So this is the entire vehicle, the actual wheels themselves. So this one will be going up and into the frame, and this will be coming down from the frame. So you'll see usually a big gap between the top of this wheel and the wheel arch. There'll be a huge gap as this wheel goes down, and you'll see this will come right up to the top of your towards the top of the frame of the vehicle, and that's the difference between those ones. Whereas this, you'll see this one will move up, but this one will stay level with the ground. So that's where there can be a positive with forward driving off-road, in the fact that it can provide traction, whereas this may mean that one wheel might not have traction at all with the ground if it's on an angle that causes the other wheel to spin freely. But as you can see here, it maintains a consistent clearance, whereas this doesn't really. So the pros and cons, moving as quickly as I can along, you invest in if you invest in a heavy duty coil spring suspension, it can, and I put this in underline, can, it doesn't mean it will, can be a better choice for off-roading or heavy towing. And one wheel doesn't affect the other wheel. So what happens with one wheel doesn't affect the other. The con is that it's more expensive in comparison. It's not as articulated off-road in comparison to the solid axle. So you're not going to get as much articulation as you move your vehicle. As you're going around off-road, you don't get as much articulation with it, and it's more prone to damage due to the complexity of it. So most four-wheel drive vehicles have moved away from having both front and rear axles being solid. So most have independent front suspension, and now some even have independent rear suspension, or they just go with the independent front suspension and they stick with the solid axle rear suspension for generally for heavy duty load carrying, as a compromise between the two. So look at your vehicle and what you get out of the factory, because it can depend on what you need to do to make the vehicle the best it can be to be off-road. Airbag suspension I put in here because it's something that it might be worth considering looking at. It is a significantly more expensive option when it comes to four-wheel driving. When I had a vehicle that was independent both front and rear, I looked at airbag suspension as a way of combating this issue of weight and lowering of ground clearance. Essentially, they're small bags which can be inflated to when you add more weight to the vehicle to keep your ride comfortable and level. They're not always practical for all types of vehicles, particularly for utes or vehicles with leaf springs at the back. When added with, and I'll expand a bit on that shortly, but when added with coil springs, the weight is distributed over the two shock spring mounts. But for leaf springs, and this is why it's an issue for utes, the weight distribution is altered altogether, and the load on the shock load bearing points are removed. Instead of being spread across the whole lot, it's moved to the middle of the spring, which will result in a pivot in the intended location. So instead of the weight being distributed across the lot, it distributes it on the center point, which can result in what we call a bent chassis for utes. So they're generally not considered a good option for utes and leaf springs as an option for the rear. So here's just an image of one where you have a coil spring with a airbag in the middle instead of a shock, and this one's a straight up airbag suspension system with no springs, but it's using airbags as a way of using both spring and shock in the one. So there are some varieties out there that's worth looking into depending upon your use and your thoughts and how much you want to spend. So it's worth looking into depending upon your vehicle type and make and what you want to get out of it. So conclusion, so we looked at a lot of things very quickly, and I didn't cover everything because it is suspension is a complicated issue and varies from vehicle to vehicle. And I don't go too much into brands because I don't like to push anyone in a particular direction. I may mention brand names like old Emu, ARB's old Emu suspension and Ironman's suspension systems. If you want my opinion, you can always ask for it and I'll give it to you honestly. But it's always worth researching and looking for what's best for your vehicle and what's best for your use of that vehicle and what you're willing to trade to get your desired results. And as mentioned, we don't touch on torsion bar because it's just not that common. And we'll look at other modifications in depth later when we have, as this is long enough as it is. So I thank you for listening and staying with me for this length of time, and hopefully this gives you a better view of suspension and lift kits in general. Any questions, comments, queries, put it to us and subscribe for more. Thank you.